The scorching Montana sun beat down on the small town of Willow Creek as Abigail Moore stumbled beneath its weight, her body betraying her once again. It was the summer of 1878, and at 22, she had already endured more than most would in a lifetime. "There she goes again," came the whispered voice of Mrs. Cunningham from the general store porch. "Taking another rest when there's work to be done." Abigail pretended not to hear, but the words cut deeper than anyone knew. Her breath came short as she leaned against the weathered post outside Jameson's Mercantile, the basket of supplies heavy in her trembling hands. The mysterious illness had plagued her for 3 years now, some days barely noticeable, other days leaving her bedridden with fever and aches that made her bones feel like shattered glass. "Lazy as the day is long," muttered Mr. Peterson as he passed by, not bothering to lower his voice. "Her poor father must be rolling in his grave, God rest his soul." Abigail straightened her back, ignoring the sharp pain shooting through her spine. Since her father's death last winter, the whispers had grown louder. With no family left and a small ranch to maintain, the townsfolk seemed to take particular interest in her perceived shortcomings. "Need help with that basket, Miss Moore?" The voice came from behind her, deep and unfamiliar. She turned to find herself looking up at a stranger tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered cowboy hat pulled low over eyes that reminded her of the summer sky. His expression was neither pitying nor judgmental, just patiently waiting for her answer. "I can manage," she replied automatically, the words she'd trained herself to say whenever someone offered assistance. Pride was sometimes all she had left. "Never said you couldn't," he responded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Just asked if you needed help." Different question entirely. Something about his straightforward manner made her pause. "Who are you? I don't believe we've met." "Name's Kieran Walsh, just rode into town yesterday." He touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Signed on with the Carson outfit." "The big spread east of town," Abigail nodded. "Well, Mr. Walsh, welcome to Willow Creek, though I'm afraid you'll find little excitement here." "Excitement's overrated, looking for steady work and a place to settle." His eyes took in her pale complexion and the slight tremor in her hands that she tried to hide. "You sure about that basket?" "Thank you," but the rest of her sentence disappeared as a wave of dizziness washed over her. The world tilted dangerously, and she felt the basket slipping from her grasp. In one fluid motion, Kieran stepped forward, catching both her elbow and the basket before either could fall. "Whoa there," he said softly, his voice free of the judgment she'd grown accustomed to hearing. The touch of his hand on her arm steadied her more than she cared to admit. "I'm fine," she insisted, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Of course you are," he agreed easily, not releasing his gentle grip. "But I'm headed this direction anyway. Let me carry this for you." Before she could protest further, he had taken the basket from her hands. "Where to?" "The small ranch just north of town." "Moore Place," she replied, surrendering to the inevitable. "It's not far. Lead the way, Miss Moore." As they started down the dusty road, Abigail felt the burning stares of the townsfolk. This would be fresh fodder for tomorrow's gossip. Abigail Moore, too weak to carry her own shopping, relying on the charity of a handsome stranger. "Pay them no mind," Kieran said quietly, apparently sensing her discomfort. "Small towns run on talk. Where I'm from, if they're not talking about you, that's when you should worry." "And where is that?" she asked, grateful for the distraction. "Colorado originally. Been moving around since the war ended." "You fought?" She studied him with new interest. He didn't seem old enough to have been in the war between the states. "Last 2 years, lied about my age." His expression clouded momentarily. "Learned quick enough there's no glory in it." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, until they reached the small but well-maintained gate that marked the boundary of the Moore property. The modest ranch house stood about 50 yards from the road, with a barn and corral visible beyond it. "It's not much," Abigail said reflexively, used to defending her home against imagined criticism. "Looks like a fine place to me," Kieran replied, genuine appreciation in his voice. "Good water source, decent grazing. Your father chose well." He did, she agreed, feeling a swell of pride. Built everything himself. We had 20 head of cattle at one point, but she trailed off, not wanting to explain how the herd had dwindled to just 8 since her illness had taken hold and her father had passed. Kieran didn't press. Instead, he carried the basket to her door and set it down carefully on the small porch. There you are, Miss Moore, safe and sound. Thank you, Mr. Walsh, I appreciate the assistance. She straightened her shoulders, reclaiming her composure, though I could have managed. His eyes crinkled at the corners. I don't doubt that for a second. He touched his hat again. Hope to see you around town, Miss Moore. As she watched him walk away, Abigail felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a flicker of curiosity about another person that wasn't overshadowed by worry about their judgment of her. That evening, as she prepared a simple stew with the vegetables from her garden, Abigail found her thoughts returning to the kind cowboy. There had been something refreshing about his manner, direct but not intrusive, helpful without being patronizing. In a town where everyone knew her history and had formed their opinions long ago, his neutral gaze had been like a cool drink of water in the summer heat. The next morning broke clear and promising. Abigail woke feeling stronger than she had in days, the unpredictable cycle of her illness having granted her a reprieve. She took advantage of the good day, working steadily through her chores, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, and checking on her small vegetable garden. By midday, she had decided to ride into town to mail a letter to the doctor in Helena who had been consulting on her case. Her mare, Penny, was a gentle soul who seemed to understand her rider's limitations, never fussing when Abigail needed to ride at a slow pace. The main street was busy with the usual afternoon traffic wagons bringing supplies to the mercantile, cowboys from nearby ranches in town for provisions or entertainment at the saloon, and local women conducting their business while exchanging the latest news. Abigail tied Penny to the hitching post outside the post office, patting the horse's neck before heading inside. After mailing her letter, she emerged to find a commotion near the general store. A crowd had gathered, and at its center stood the towering figure of Kieran Walsh, facing off against 3 men Abigail recognized as hands from the Carson Ranch. One of them, a wiry man with a perpetual sneer named Harley Davis, was nursing a bloodied nose. "You'll regret that, Walsh," Davis snarled. "Nobody crosses me and keeps their job." Kieran's stance was relaxed but alert. Seems worth losing a job over, stopping a man from harassing a woman half his size. It was then that Abigail noticed young Sally Jenkins, the seamstress's 16-year-old daughter, standing tearfully behind Kieran. The girl's dress was torn at the shoulder, and she was clutching the fabric together with trembling fingers. "She was asking for it," one of Davis's companions muttered. "No woman asks to be manhandled," Kieran replied, his voice dangerously soft. "Now, I suggest you boys head back to the ranch and sleep off whatever's got you thinking this kind of behavior is acceptable." Sheriff Wilson finally pushed through the crowd. "What's the meaning of this disturbance?" Multiple voices erupted, but Kieran remained silent, his eyes never leaving Davis. Sally's mother rushed forward, pulling her daughter into a protective embrace. "These Carson boys were bothering my Sally," she explained, her voice shaking with anger. "This gentleman stepped in when they wouldn't take no for an answer." The sheriff looked between the parties, the political calculation visible on his face. The Carson Ranch was the biggest employer in the county, and its owner had considerable influence. "Davis, you and your friends clear out," he finally said. "Go sleep it off like the man said. And Walsh," he turned to Kieran, "appreciate your intentions, but we don't need troublemakers in Willow Creek." "With all due respect, Sheriff," Abigail found herself speaking up, surprising even herself, "it sounds like Mr. Walsh prevented trouble, not caused it." All eyes turned to her, and she felt her cheeks flush under the scrutiny, but something about the injustice of the situation gave her courage. "Miss Moore," the sheriff acknowledged with a nod, "this isn't your concern." "I disagree," she said, stepping closer. "If we allow men to harass young women on our streets, what kind of town are we?" A murmur of agreement rose from several of the women in the crowd. Mrs. Jenkins gave Abigail a grateful look. The sheriff, sensing the shift in public opinion, cleared his throat. Well, in any case, it's over now. Everyone back to your business. As the crowd dispersed, Abigail found herself standing near Kieran, who was dusting off his hat. Seems I should be thanking you now, he said with a slight smile. I only spoke the truth, she replied. What happened? Davis and his friends were getting too familiar with Miss Jenkins. She clearly wasn't interested. When I suggested they leave her be, Davis took exception. He shrugged as if it were of no consequence. Probably cost me my job. That's not right, Abigail frowned. Mr. Carson should know what really happened. Men like Carson generally believe what foremen like Davis tell them. Kieran settled his hat back on his head. No matter, plenty of other ranches needing hands. What will you do now? Find somewhere to bed down for the night, then start looking tomorrow. His expression remained unconcerned, but Abigail caught a flicker of worry in his eyes. Before she could reconsider, Abigail heard herself saying, I have a spare room, and I could use some help with repairs around the ranch. Kieran looked at her in surprise. That's mighty generous, Miss Moore, but what would people say? They already talk about me, she replied with a resigned smile. What's one more topic of conversation? Besides, my father always said a working ranch needs working hands. I've been trying to manage alone, but she gestured vaguely at herself, a reference to her limitations. He studied her face for a long moment. I wouldn't want to impose. It's a business arrangement, she clarified quickly. Room and board in exchange for labor, if you're interested. A slow smile spread across his face. When you put it that way, Miss Moore, I'd be a fool to refuse. That evening, Abigail showed Kieran to the small but clean room that had once belonged to the ranch hand her father had employed before his illness had forced them to cut expenses. The man watched her with a careful eye as she moved around, showing him where things were kept and explaining the work that needed doing. The roof needs patching before the fall rains, she said, pointing to water stains on the ceiling, and the north fence line has been giving me trouble. I can start on those tomorrow, he nodded. What about your cattle? Just 8 head now, she admitted. I've been keeping them in the near pasture where I can check on them easily. Smart, he approved. We can move them to the better grazing once the fence is secure. The we in his statement caused a curious warmth in her chest. It had been so long since she'd had anyone to share the burden of the ranch with. There's stew left from dinner, she said, changing the subject. Help yourself if you're hungry. Breakfast is at sunrise. I'll be up before then, he assured her. Thank you, Miss Moore, for the opportunity. Abigail, she said impulsively, if we're to be working together, you might as well use my given name. Abigail, he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. Then you must call me Kieran. She nodded, suddenly feeling shy. Good night, Kieran. Good night, Abigail. Rest well. As she made her way to her own room, Abigail wondered if she had made a terrible mistake inviting a virtual stranger into her home. But something about Kieran Walsh inspired trust, and truthfully, she was desperate for help with the ranch. If she lost it, she would have nothing left of her father's legacy or her own independence. The next morning, Abigail woke to the smell of coffee brewing. For a disoriented moment, she thought her father must still be alive, that the past year had been a terrible dream. Then reality settled back in, along with the memory of her new arrangement. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Kieran stoking the cookstove fire. A pot of coffee was already bubbling, and he had set the table with the plates and utensils she kept on the open shelf. Hope you don't mind, he said, straightening up. Thought I'd get things started. Not at all, she replied, surprised at the initiative. You didn't have to do that. Early riser, he explained, always have been. Figured I might as well make myself useful. He poured her a cup of coffee and set it on the table. How are you feeling this morning? The question took her aback. Most people in town had stopped asking about her health long ago, assuming she was either constantly ill or worse, faking her symptoms for attention. Better than yesterday, she answered honestly. It comes and goes, he nodded, accepting her answer without pressing for details. Good day to work on that roof, then. Clear skies. They shared a simple breakfast of oatmeal and dried apples from last season's harvest. Kieran ate with the hearty appetite of a working man, complimenting her on the meal though it was nothing special. "I'll show you where the tools are kept," she said as they finished. "My father had quite a collection." The tool shed was organized with the precision of a man who respected his implements. Kieran ran his hand appreciatively over the workbench. "Your father was a craftsman." "He could build or fix almost anything," Abigail agreed, feeling the familiar pang of loss. "He tried to teach me, but—" "But what?" Kieran prompted when she trailed off. "I started getting sick before I could learn everything I needed to know," she admitted. "There are still so many things about running this place that I'm figuring out as I go. We all start somewhere," he said simply. "What you've managed on your own is impressive." His words caught her off guard. No one had called her efforts impressive before. Most saw only what wasn't done, not what she had accomplished despite her limitations. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." The day settled into a rhythm. Kieran worked on the roof while Abigail tended to her usual chores. By midday, the temperature had risen considerably, and she brought him a dipper of cool water from the well. He had removed his shirt in the heat, and Abigail found herself momentarily transfixed by the sight of his sun-bronzed torso, muscles shifting as he hammered a patch into place. A network of scars traced across his left shoulder and down his side, evidence of old wounds. Feeling her gaze, he looked down and smiled, seemingly unembarrassed by either his state of undress or her obvious interest. "Water looks mighty welcome," he called, making his way carefully to the edge of the roof. Abigail handed up the dipper, trying to appear unaffected. "How's it coming along? Found 3 bad spots so far," he reported between gulps. "This heat's good for something, shows exactly where the shingles have warped. Will you be able to finish today? This section, yes, might need another day for the rest." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Your father built this place to last, just needs a bit of maintenance." "Like most things, I suppose," she mused. He studied her for a moment. "How long have you been sick?" The direct question surprised her, but she found she didn't mind answering him. "About 3 years now, started with fevers and exhaustion." "The doctors in Helena have different theories, but no real answers. Must be frustrating." "The not knowing is almost worse than the symptoms," she agreed. "Some days I feel almost normal, then it returns without warning. And the townsfolk don't understand," he guessed. "They think I'm making excuses." The bitterness crept into her voice despite her effort to keep it at bay. "Lazy, they call me, as if I choose this." Kieran's expression darkened. "People fear what they don't understand makes them cruel sometimes." Something in his tone suggested personal experience with such cruelty, but Abigail didn't press. They had only just met, after all. "I should let you get back to work," she said instead. "Dinner will be ready at sundown." The rest of the day passed peacefully. Abigail found herself humming as she worked in her garden, harvesting beans and checking on the progress of her tomatoes. The simple pleasure of having another person in the house, the sound of hammering from the roof, made the place feel alive again in a way it hadn't since her father's death. By evening, Kieran had completed repairs on the worst section of the roof and had cleaned and organized the tools with the same care her father would have shown. When he came in for dinner, his face was sunburned but satisfied. "Roof won't leak now, at least not in that section," he reported, washing his hands at the basin she'd set out. "Tomorrow I'll check the rest and start on that fence line." Abigail had prepared a more substantial meal than usual, a chicken she'd been saving, with roasted potatoes and the fresh beans from her garden. It felt good to cook for someone who appreciated it, and Kieran's obvious enjoyment of the food was rewarding. As they ate, he told her stories of his travels since the war, working cattle drives in Texas, mining in Colorado, even a brief stint with a railroad crew. He spoke without embellishment or bravado, simply relating his experiences in that straightforward manner she was coming to appreciate. "What brought you to Montana?" she asked as they finished the meal. A shadow crossed his face. "Needed a fresh start, heard the territory was growing, plenty of opportunity for a man willing to work." She sensed there was more to the story but didn't push. Everyone had parts of their past they preferred to keep private. Certainly she did. "Well, I'm glad your travels brought you here," she said instead, surprising herself with the sincerity behind the words. He looked up, catching her gaze. "So am I, Abigail, so am I." The days fell into a pleasant pattern. Kieran proved to be as good as his word, tackling the ranch repairs with skill and dedication. The roof was completed, the fence line reinforced, and the barn door that had been sticking for months now swung smoothly on its hinges. What impressed Abigail most, however, was his adaptability to her condition. On mornings when she woke feeling well, he would include her in the work, teaching her the skills her father hadn't had time to pass on. On days when the illness left her weak and feverish, he simply adjusted, taking on her chores without comment or complaint. A week into their arrangement, Abigail decided it was time to go into town for supplies. She felt strong enough for the trip, and they needed flour and sugar that couldn't be produced on the ranch. "I'll come with you," Kieran offered when she mentioned her plans over breakfast. "Could use a few things myself." The suggestion of his company both pleased and worried her. "People will talk," she warned. "Let them," he shrugged. "Unless you'd rather I didn't." "No," she admitted. "I'd welcome the company." They set out after the morning chores, taking the wagon since they planned to bring back a fair amount of supplies. The day was pleasantly warm, with a light breeze that made the journey comfortable. As they approached town, Abigail felt the familiar tension creeping into her shoulders. Willow Creek had once been a place of comfort and community for her family. Now it represented judgment and isolation. Kieran seemed to sense her discomfort. "We'll make it quick," he promised. "In and out before the gossips can sharpen their tongues." His attempt at humor brought a smile to her face. "I shouldn't let it bother me after all this time." "Doesn't make it any easier to bear," he replied, his understanding warming her more than the sun overhead. As expected, their arrival together drew curious stares. Kieran helped her down from the wagon with a courteous hand, then secured the horses while she made a mental list of what they needed. The mercantile was busy with the usual morning shoppers. Conversations paused as they entered, then resumed in lower tones, undoubtedly centered on the pair of them. Mr. Jameson, the proprietor, greeted them with professional politeness. "Miss Moore, good to see you about, and Mr. Walsh, isn't it? Heard you left the Carson outfit." "Found a better situation," Kieran replied easily, nodding toward Abigail. "Miss Moore was kind enough to hire me on to help with her ranch." The older man's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that so? Well, good for you both." They moved through the store, gathering the items on Abigail's list. Kieran added a few personal necessities: tobacco for his pipe, a new shirt to replace one torn while mending the fence, a small book that he tucked away before she could see the title. As Abigail was examining some fabric, considering whether she could afford new curtains for the kitchen, she overheard Mrs. Cunningham's carrying whisper to another woman. Living alone with a man, not even married. Her poor mother would be scandalized. "And you know she can't possibly be managing that ranch. Probably got him doing everything while she lounges about with her illness." The words stung, but before Abigail could react, Kieran's voice cut through the store's murmured conversations. "Pardon me, ladies," he said, his tone polite but carrying an edge. "I couldn't help overhearing your concern for Miss Moore's reputation." Mrs. Cunningham had the grace to look embarrassed at being caught gossiping, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "It's not proper, a young woman alone with a hired hand. People will talk." "People already talk," Kieran replied, his voice level, "but they do better to talk about how Miss Moore manages a ranch while battling an illness that would keep most folks bedridden." The store had gone silent, all pretense of not listening abandoned. "She works from sunup to sundown," Kieran continued, his gaze sweeping the watching faces. "Even on days when she can barely stand. She works harder than any of you who stand in judgment, and she does it without complaint." Abigail felt heat rising in her cheeks, both from embarrassment at being the center of attention and from a deep, unexpected gratitude for his defense. "Well," Mrs. Cunningham huffed, "we're only concerned for her well-being." "Then perhaps offer help instead of criticism," Kieran suggested. Or at the very least, the courtesy of silence when you have nothing kind to say. With that, he turned back to Abigail, who was clutching the bolt of fabric like a shield. "This would look nice in your kitchen," he said, as if the confrontation hadn't happened. "Brightens the room." She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. No one had defended her so openly before, not since her father had passed. They completed their purchases in a store now awkwardly quiet. Mr. Jameson, perhaps feeling guilty for allowing the gossip in his establishment, threw in a small bag of peppermint candy on the house. Outside, Kieran loaded their supplies into the wagon while Abigail waited, still processing what had happened. "I'm sorry if I overstepped," he said finally as he helped her up to the seat. "Couldn't stand hearing them talk about you that way." "No one's ever defended me like that," she admitted as he climbed up beside her. "Thank you," he shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Just spoke the truth as I see it." As they pulled away from the mercantile, Abigail noticed something had shifted. Some of the townsfolk nodded to her, offering small smiles where before there had been only judgment or pity. Others looked away, perhaps reconsidering their assumptions. "You've given them something to think about," she observed. "Good, they could use some thinking." His expression softened as he glanced at her. "You all right, better than all right," she replied honestly. "It feels like I can breathe a little easier." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves a soothing background to her thoughts. "Kieran," she said finally, "why did you really leave the Carson Ranch, before the incident with Davis, I mean?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low. "The foreman and I had differences about how to treat horses, mainly. He believes in breaking their spirit, I don't. And Davis is the foreman's cousin. Does whatever he's told and enjoys it too much." His hands tightened on the reins. "When I refused to use the methods they wanted, things got uncomfortable, so you were already planning to leave when you stepped in to help Sally." "Was looking for an excuse," he admitted. "Just didn't expect it to come in that form." Abigail considered this. "You seem to make a habit of standing up for people." A wry smile touched his lips. "Only when they deserve it." When they returned to the ranch, Abigail felt unusually tired. The confrontation in town had taken more out of her than she'd realized. As they unloaded the supplies, her hands began to tremble with the familiar warning sign of an impending episode. Kieran noticed immediately. "Go rest," he said firmly. "I'll finish here." "I can help," she protested, even as a wave of dizziness washed over her. "Abigail." His voice was gentle but brooked no argument. "You've done enough today. Rest now so you can work tomorrow." The simple logic free of judgment or pity made it easier to accept. She nodded and made her way to the house, grateful for his understanding. By the time she reached her bedroom, the familiar aches had settled into her joints, and a chill ran through her despite the summer heat. She changed into her nightgown and crawled beneath the quilt, her body heavy with exhaustion. She must have fallen asleep, because when she next opened her eyes, the room was dimmer and a cool cloth lay across her forehead. Kieran sat in the chair by her bed, whittling what appeared to be a small wooden horse. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, her voice rasping. He set aside his carving. "Couple of hours. You had a fever." He dipped the cloth in a basin of water, wrung it out, and replaced it on her forehead. "Better now, a little," she admitted. "You didn't have to sit with me. Wanted to make sure you were all right." He offered her a glass of water, supporting her head as she drank. "Supplies are put away, chickens are fed, cattle checked, everything's in order." Gratitude washed over her, along with something deeper she wasn't ready to name. "Thank you," she whispered. "Rest some more," he advised, settling back in the chair. "I'll be here if you need anything." As she drifted back to sleep, Abigail realized that for the first time in years she felt truly safe. The knowledge was as comforting as the cool cloth on her brow. The next morning, Abigail woke feeling much improved. The fever had broken during the night, and though she was weak, the worst of the episode had passed. She dressed slowly and made her way to the kitchen, where she found evidence of Kieran's breakfast, a clean plate in the dish basin and coffee still warm on the stove. Through the window, she could see him in the corral, working with her father's old gelding, a stubborn animal that had resisted all her attempts to ride him since her father's death. Kieran was speaking to the horse in low tones, his body language relaxed but authoritative. Abigail poured herself some coffee and stepped out onto the porch to watch. The morning air was crisp and clean, promising another fine day. In the corral, the gelding was responding to Kieran's gentle guidance, circling him with alert ears and curious eyes. "Morning," Kieran called when he spotted her. "Feeling better?" "Much," she replied. "Thank you for taking care of things." He nodded, then returned his attention to the horse. "This fellow's got potential, just needs consistent handling." "My father called him troublemaker for a reason," she warned. Kieran laughed. "Names have power. Maybe he's just living up to expectations." Abigail sipped her coffee, enjoying the peaceful scene. "What would you call him?" Kieran studied the gelding thoughtfully. "Copper, maybe." "For his coloring." "Copper," she repeated. "I like that." They settled into a new routine over the next few weeks. When Abigail was well, they worked side by side on the ranch tasks, Kieran teaching her the skills she needed to manage on her own. When she was ill, he took on the necessary work without complaint, often sitting with her in the evenings, carving his little wooden figures or reading aloud from the book he'd purchased in town, a collection of poetry that surprised her with its delicacy in his rough hands. Summer began to wane, the evenings growing cooler as August gave way to September. The ranch was in better shape than it had been in years. The cattle were thriving in the repaired pastures, the chicken coop had been reinforced against predators, and the garden had yielded a bountiful harvest that Abigail had preserved for the coming winter. More importantly, the townsfolk's attitudes had begun to shift. News of Kieran's defense of her had spread, and on their infrequent trips to town, Abigail noticed more friendly greetings and fewer whispers. Several of the women had even stopped by the ranch with preserves or baked goods, ostensibly to welcome Kieran, but clearly also extending an olive branch to Abigail. One golden afternoon, as they sat on the porch shelling the last of the season's peas, Abigail found the courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. "Will you stay for the winter?" Kieran's hands stilled their work. "Would you want me to?" "Yes," she answered simply. "The ranch runs better with two pairs of hands, and she hesitated, then pushed on. "I've grown accustomed to your company." A slow smile spread across his face. "Then I'll stay, at least until spring." The "at least" hung between them, a possibility neither was ready to define further. That evening, as Kieran stoked the fire against the growing autumn chill, Abigail found herself studying his profile, appreciating the strong line of his jaw and the gentleness in his hands as he arranged the logs. Over the weeks, she had pieced together more of his story, the difficult childhood with an alcoholic father, his time in the war that had left both physical and invisible scars, the restless years after as he sought something he couldn't name. He glanced up, catching her gaze, and smiled. "Penny for your thoughts. I was just thinking about how much has changed since you arrived," she admitted. "The ranch, the town's attitude, everything seems different. For the better, I hope, definitely for the better." She hesitated, then added softly, "I was beginning to think I'd have to sell the place, before you came." He settled into the chair opposite hers. "And now I believe I can make it work, thanks to you." "You were already doing it," he corrected gently. "I just provided an extra pair of hands." "It was more than that," she insisted. "You believed I could do it. That made all the difference." Their eyes met across the small space and something shifted in the air between them. Kieran leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. Abigail, a sharp knock at the door interrupted whatever he had been about to say. They both started, the moment broken. Kieran rose to answer it, his brow furrowed. Visitors were rare, especially after sunset. When he opened the door, Sheriff Wilson stood on the porch, hat in hand. "Evening, Walsh. Miss Moore around?" "I'm here, Sheriff," Abigail said, coming to stand beside Kieran. "What brings you out this way so late?" The lawman looked uncomfortable. "Got some news you should know. Davis and some of the Carson boys have been spreading talk in town. Ugly talk." Kieran's posture stiffened. "What kind of talk? About you two, living arrangements and such?" The sheriff shifted his weight. Normally, I'd pay it no mind, but Davis has been drinking heavy since you embarrassed him over the Jenkins girl, Walsh. He's making threats. Against Abigail. Kieran's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Both of you, the sheriff clarified, says you stole his job and that Miss Moore is. He glanced apologetically at Abigail. Well, the words aren't fit to repeat in mixed company. I appreciate the warning, Abigail said, her heart pounding. But what can we do? Just stay alert, the sheriff advised. I've warned Davis to mind his tongue and keep his distance, but men like that don't always listen to reason. Might be good to have a shotgun handy just in case. After the sheriff left, Kieran checked all the doors and windows, his expression grim. I'm sorry, Abigail, this is my doing. Don't be ridiculous, she replied, though her hands trembled slightly. Davis was trouble long before you came to town. Still. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she now recognized as a sign of agitation. Maybe I should sleep in the barn for a while, give the gossips less to talk about. Absolutely not, she said firmly. I won't have you uncomfortable because of what people might say. Besides, if Davis is truly a threat, I'd rather have you close by. The look he gave her was unreadable. All right, but I'll keep watch tonight just to be safe. Despite her protests, Kieran insisted on taking the first watch. Abigail retreated to her bedroom but found sleep elusive. The sheriff's warning had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Not for herself, she had endured the town's judgment before, but for Kieran, who had already sacrificed one job because of his principles. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep and made her way back to the main room. Kieran sat by the window, his father's shotgun across his knees, staring out into the darkness. Anything? She asked softly. He shook his head. All quiet, you should rest. Can't sleep, she admitted, settling into the chair opposite him. Keep thinking about what the sheriff said. Kieran's expression softened. Davis is all talk, men like that usually are. But not always, she pointed out. No, he agreed, not always. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional pop from the dying fire. Tell me about your father, Kieran said finally. You mention him often, but never in detail. The request surprised her, but Abigail found she wanted to share these memories with him. He was a good man, strong but gentle, never raised his voice, never raised his hand. Said a man who had to shout to be heard hadn't earned the right to speak. Sounds wise. He was. She smiled at the memories. Came west as a young man, worked as a hand on other people's ranches until he saved enough to buy this land. Met my mother in town, she was the school teacher. They had 10 good years together before she died of pneumonia. How old were you? 8. Old enough to remember her, but young enough that many of the memories have faded. She wrapped her arms around herself against a sudden chill. Father never remarried. Said he'd been blessed with one great love, and that was enough for any man. Kieran nodded, understanding in his eyes. And then you got sick. Yes, father was remarkable about it, never doubted me, never complained about the extra work. Just adapted like it was the most natural thing in the world. She swallowed against the tightness in her throat. When he died, I lost more than my father. I lost the only person who truly believed in me. Until now, Kieran said quietly. Their eyes met across the dim room, and Abigail felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Yes, she whispered. Until now. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Kieran cleared his throat and looked back to the window. Dawn's still hours away. You should try to sleep. Only if you promise to wake me when it's my turn to watch, she countered. He smiled. Deal. The next few days passed without incident, and the tension gradually eased. Abigail began to think the sheriff's warning had been overly cautious, that Davis's threats were indeed just drunken bluster. Then came the night of the first autumn storm. Rain lashed against the windows, and wind howled around the eaves of the ranch house. Abigail and Kieran had just finished a quiet dinner when they heard the horses whinnying in distress from the barn. Something spooked them, Kieran said, rising from the table. I'd better check. I'll come with you, Abigail offered, reaching for her shawl. No need for both of us to get soaked, he replied. I'll be quick. She watched from the window as he dashed through the downpour to the barn, lantern held high against the darkness. Minutes ticked by and unease grew in her chest. It shouldn't take this long to check on the horses. Just as she was considering going after him, the barn door flew open. Kieran emerged, running full tilt toward the house. Behind him, orange flames licked at the barn door. "Fire!" he shouted as he burst into the house, water streaming from his clothes. "Barn's ablaze," someone said it deliberately. Horror washed over her. "The animals, I got them out," he assured her, already grabbing buckets. "But we need to contain it before it spreads to the house." Despite the pouring rain, the fire was spreading quickly, fed by the dry hay stored for winter. Abigail and Kieran formed a bucket brigade, passing water from the well to the blazing structure. The heat was intense, the smoke choking even through the rain. "It's no use," Kieran shouted after several exhausting minutes. "Building's lost. We need to focus on keeping it from spreading." They redirected their efforts to wetting down the ground between the barn and house, creating a firebreak the flames couldn't cross. The rain helped, but the wind kept shifting, carrying embers dangerously close to the house roof. As they worked frantically, Abigail caught movement at the edge of her vision, a figure on horseback, watching from the boundary of her property. Even through the rain and darkness, she recognized the silhouette of Harley Davis. "Kieran," she called, pointing. He followed her gaze, his expression hardening as he spotted the rider. For a moment, it seemed he might pursue Davis, but another gust of wind carried a shower of sparks toward the house, demanding their immediate attention. By the time the danger to the house was past, Davis was gone, and the barn was nothing but a smoldering skeleton against the night sky. The animals huddled miserably in the corral, exposed to the elements but alive thanks to Kieran's quick action. Exhausted and soaked to the skin, they retreated to the house. Abigail's hands shook as she built up the fire, the reality of what had happened sinking in. "He could have killed the animals," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "He could have burned us out completely." Kieran's face was grim as he stripped off his sodden shirt. In the firelight, the scars on his torso stood out starkly against his skin. "This isn't going to end with the barn." "What do we do?" she asked, handing him a blanket. He wrapped it around his shoulders, his eyes meeting hers. "We have two choices: report it to the sheriff and hope he acts, or, she prompted when he hesitated, "or I confront Davis directly, end this now." Fear clutched at her heart. "That's too dangerous. Davis won't fight fair. Neither will I if it comes to that." The hardness in his voice reminded her that, beneath his gentle manner, lay a man who had survived a war and years of harsh living. "No," she said firmly. "We go to the sheriff first. If he won't help, then we reconsider." Kieran studied her face, then nodded slowly. "All right. First light, we ride to town." They spent a miserable night, taking turns watching for any return of Davis or his friends. The rain eventually stopped, leaving a raw, damp chill in the air. Abigail's body ached with exhaustion and the aftereffects of their firefighting efforts, but anxiety kept her alert. When dawn finally broke, gray and cheerless, they made their way to town. The sheriff listened to their account with increasing concern, his expression darkening when they described seeing Davis at the property line. "Arson's a serious charge," he said finally, "but it's your word against his, and Carson has influence in this county." "Are you saying you won't do anything?" Abigail asked, disbelieving. "I'm saying I need proof," the sheriff clarified. "I'll ride out to your place, look around. Maybe there's evidence Davis left behind. In the meantime, I'll have a word with him, let him know he's being watched." It wasn't the decisive action they'd hoped for, but it was something. As they left the sheriff's office, Kieran's expression was thunderous. "Not enough," he muttered. "Davis won't be deterred by a warning." "We have to give the law a chance to work," Abigail insisted, though her confidence was waning. As they prepared to leave town, Mrs. Jenkins approached them outside the mercantile. "Miss Moore, Mr. Walsh," she greeted them, concern evident in her face. "I heard about your barn, how terrible." "News travels fast," Kieran observed. "Small town," Mrs. Jenkins shrugged. "Listen, I wanted you to know Davis was drinking heavily at the saloon last night, boasting about teaching you both a lesson. Several people heard him, my husband included." Hope flared in Abigail's chest. "Would your husband be willing to tell the sheriff what he heard?" Already has, Mrs. Jenkins confirmed, along with Mr. Peterson and young Tom Bradley. After what you did for Sally, Mr. Walsh, folks are more inclined to stand with you than with Davis. The knowledge that they had allies in town was unexpectedly moving. Thank you, Abigail said sincerely. That means a great deal. As they rode home, Kieran seemed lost in thought. Something's changed, he finally said. What do you mean, the town? They're choosing sides. And not the ones I expected. Abigail considered this. Maybe they just needed someone to show them another way of looking at things. At me, he glanced at her, a smile softening his features. Or maybe they just needed to see you through someone else's eyes. The warmth that spread through her had nothing to do with the weak autumn sun breaking through the clouds. At the ranch, the charred remains of the barn looked even more devastating in daylight. Kieran immediately set about creating a temporary shelter for the animals, using salvaged lumber and canvas. Sheriff Wilson arrived mid-afternoon, as promised. He examined the scene carefully, paying particular attention to a partially burned lantern found in the wreckage, one that didn't belong to the ranch. Carson brand, he noted, showing them the mark stamped on the metal base. This is the evidence I needed. I'll bring Davis in for questioning. Relief washed over Abigail. Thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me yet, he cautioned. Carson will fight this. And even if Davis is held accountable, his friends might decide to continue what he started. Let them try, Kieran said quietly. We'll be ready. After the sheriff departed, they surveyed the damage more thoroughly. Most of their winter hay was lost, along with various tools and equipment. The financial setback was considerable, especially for a small operation already struggling. We'll manage, Kieran assured her, seeing her worried expression. The Petersons have extra hay they might sell at a fair price, and we can rebuild the barn before the first snow. We, she repeated softly. You still say we even after all this? He looked at her, his expression serious. Where else would I be, Abigail? The question hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Before she could respond, hoofbeats sounded on the road. They both tensed, fearing Davis's return, but it was Mr. Peterson and his 2 grown sons who appeared, along with several other men from town. Heard about your trouble, Peterson called as they dismounted. Thought you could use some help with that barn. Abigail stared in astonishment. Mr. Peterson had been among the most vocal critics of her laziness in the past. That's very kind, she managed. Peterson had the grace to look uncomfortable. Wasn't always fair to you, Miss Moore. After what Walsh said in the store that day got me thinking. My late sister had spells like yours, never did right by her while she was alive. Maybe I can do better by you. The simple apology, gruff though it was, brought unexpected tears to Abigail's eyes. Thank you, she said sincerely. We'd welcome the help. What followed was a remarkable display of community support. More townspeople arrived throughout the day, bringing food, building supplies, and willing hands. By sunset, the framework for a new barn was already taking shape. As Abigail served coffee to the workers, she found herself beside Mrs. Cunningham, who had brought a substantial pot of stew for the hungry men. I owe you an apology, the older woman said without preamble. Been judging you without understanding. My husband says I have a talent for that. She smiled ruefully. He's not wrong. It's difficult to understand something you haven't experienced, Abigail replied, finding forgiveness easier than she'd expected. That's a generous way of putting it, Mrs. Cunningham glanced toward Kieran, who was working alongside the other men, directing the barn raising with natural authority. He's a good man, you're Mr. Walsh. He is, Abigail agreed, not bothering to correct the possessive, though not everyone sees it that way. Davis and his kind see only what threatens them. A man of genuine character makes them uncomfortable. The older woman patted Abigail's hand. Hold on to him, my dear. Such men are rare indeed. By nightfall, the barn's basic structure was complete, a remarkable achievement for a single day's work. The volunteers departed with promises to return the following day, leaving Abigail and Kieran alone amid the evidence of their community's changed attitude. I still can't believe it, Abigail said as they sat on the porch, watching the stars appear in the clear night sky. After years of judgment, suddenly they're bringing food and building us a barn. People can surprise you, Kieran replied, his pipe glowing softly in the darkness, for better or worse. Speaking of which, she hesitated, the sheriff stopped me before he left. Davis wasn't at the saloon or the Carson ranch. No one's seen him since last night, Kieran frowned. That's troubling. Sheriff thinks he might have fled the territory now that there are witnesses willing to testify against him. Maybe, he allowed, though his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. We'll keep our guard up, just in case. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the night sounds of the ranch wrapping around them like a familiar blanket. Despite the destruction of the barn and the uncertainty about Davis, Abigail felt a strange contentment. Her home was being restored, the town had rallied to their aid, and beside her sat a man who had changed everything with his quiet strength and unwavering belief in her. Kieran, she said softly, what happens when the barn is rebuilt and winter comes? He turned to look at her, his face half shadowed in the dim light from the window. What do you mean? You said you'd stay until spring at least, but what then? Will you move on, find another ranch, another town? The question had been weighing on her mind for weeks, growing more urgent as their partnership deepened into something neither had named but both felt. Kieran was silent for a long moment, then set his pipe aside. That depends. On what? On whether there's a reason for me to stay. His voice was low, almost hesitant, so unlike his usual confidence. Abigail's heart hammered in her chest. What kind of reason would be enough? He shifted in his chair to face her fully. Abigail, when I came to this town, I wasn't looking for anything permanent, just work and a fresh start. But then I met you. He paused, searching for words. You're the strongest person I've ever known. The way you face each day, never giving up despite everything, it humbles me. She shook her head, embarrassed by the praise. I'm just surviving. No, he contradicted gently. You're living. There's a difference. He reached across the space between them, his hand finding hers in the darkness. I've been running for years. From the war, from memories, from getting too attached to any place or person. But here with you, I don't want to run anymore. Abigail's throat tightened with emotion. What are you saying, Kieran? I'm saying I love you, he answered simply. And if you could see your way to loving me back, I'd stay. Not just until spring, but for good. The words she'd been afraid to hope for hung in the night air. Abigail felt tears spill onto her cheeks as years of loneliness and struggle gave way to something beautiful and unexpected. I do love you, she whispered. I think I have since that first day when you carried my basket and didn't ask what was wrong with me. His hand tightened around hers. Nothing's wrong with you, Abigail, nothing at all. He rose from his chair and knelt before her, still holding her hand. I don't have much to offer, no land of my own, no fortune, just my hands and my heart, but they're yours if you want them. That's all I need, she assured him, her free hand reaching to touch his face. That's everything. In the silver moonlight, his smile was luminous. He leaned forward, and their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. His arms encircled her, strong and protective, and she melted into his embrace, the worries of the day falling away in the certainty of this newfound love. When they finally parted, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. We should probably get married, he murmured, a hint of laughter in his voice. Give the town something new to talk about. They'll talk anyway, she replied, smiling through her tears. Might as well give them a good story. The following days were filled with both joy and vigilance. The barn raising continued, with more townsfolk joining the effort each day. By the end of the week, a new structure stood in place of the old, sturdier and larger than its predecessor. Meanwhile, Sheriff Wilson continued his search for Davis, who remained conspicuously absent. The prevailing theory in town was that he had indeed fled to avoid prosecution, but Kieran maintained a watchful eye, particularly at night. Amid these concerns, Abigail and Kieran quietly announced their engagement. The news was met with genuine congratulations from their newfound allies in town, and even a begrudging acknowledgement from Mr. Carson, who had distanced himself from Davis after learning of the arson. Spring wedding. Mrs. Jenkins suggested as she helped Abigail select fabric for a new dress. Sooner, I think, Abigail replied, running her fingers over a bolt of deep blue cotton. No reason to wait. The truth was, she didn't want to delay building their life together. Each day brought its own challenges. Her health remained unpredictable, and the financial strain of replacing what had been lost in the fire was considerable. But facing these challenges with Kieran by her side made them seem manageable in a way they never had before. One crisp October evening, as they sat by the fire planning their wedding, a knock came at the door. Both tensed, memories of the sheriff's late-night warning still fresh. Kieran reached for the shotgun before answering. On the porch stood a weary-looking man Abigail didn't recognize. Tall and lean, with a badge pinned to his dust-covered coat. Marshal James Byon, he introduced himself. Looking for Sheriff Wilson. He's in town, Kieran replied, not lowering the shotgun. What's your business with him? The marshal eyed the weapon but seemed unperturbed. Tracking a fugitive, Harley Davis. Word is he was causing trouble in these parts before he disappeared. Relief washed over Abigail. You're after Davis for what? Murder, madam. Killed a man in Wyoming territory before heading this way. Been on his trail for 2 weeks. The marshal's shrewd eyes took in the new barn. Heard he might have been involved in some arson recently. You heard right, Kieran confirmed, finally lowering the gun. Come in, Marshal. We've got quite a story to tell you. Over coffee, they related the events of the past weeks. The marshal listened attentively, occasionally making notes in a small book. Fits his pattern, he commented when they'd finished. Davis worked his way through 3 territories, always the same approach. Gets hired at a ranch, causes trouble, moves on when things get hot. The murder was new, though. Man confronted him about stealing horses. Davis shot him in the back. Any idea where he might have gone from here? Kieran asked, heading south, most likely, toward New Mexico territory. The marshal pocketed his notebook. I'll coordinate with your sheriff, see if we can pick up his trail. After the marshal departed, Abigail felt a weight lift from her shoulders. With federal authorities involved, Davis would find it much harder to return and cause more trouble. You know what this means. She said, taking Kieran's hand, we don't have to keep looking over our shoulders. He pulled her close, dropping a kiss on her forehead. Good, I'd rather look at you anyway. The weeks leading up to their wedding passed in a blur of preparation and hard work. The ranch needed winterizing, the new barn required finishing touches, and Abigail's health fluctuated with the changing season. Through it all, Kieran remained steadfast, adapting their workload to her capabilities each day without complaint. News came that Marshal Byon had tracked Davis to a town near the territorial border, where he'd been arrested for another attempted robbery. The likelihood of his return to Willow Creek was now remote, allowing Abigail and Kieran to focus fully on their future together. They were married on a bright November day, with most of the town in attendance. The ceremony was held in the small church, decorated with autumn leaves and late-blooming wildflowers gathered by the local children. Abigail wore a dress of the deep blue fabric she'd chosen, with Mrs. Jenkins's skilled handiwork transforming it into something elegant yet practical. Kieran, in a new shirt and his best trousers, looked at her as if she were the most precious sight he'd ever beheld. When they spoke their vows, his voice was clear and unwavering, his eyes never leaving hers. I promise to stand by you in sickness and in health, he said, the traditional words taking on special meaning for them both. To believe in you when others doubt, to see your strength when you feel weak, and to love you through all the seasons of our life together. Abigail's response was equally heartfelt, her voice steady despite the emotion welling in her chest. I promise to be your partner in all things, to value your kindness and your courage, to create a home with you built on trust and understanding, and to love you completely, this day and always. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, the house and new barn festooned with ribbons and lanterns. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in town, and fiddle music filled the air as people danced and celebrated well into the evening. As the last guests departed, Abigail stood on the porch with her new husband, watching the wagons and riders disappear down the road. Happy, Mrs. Walsh? Kieran asked, his arm around her waist. More than I ever thought possible, she replied honestly. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined any of this. The ranch thriving, the town accepting me, finding someone who. Words failed her. Who loves you exactly as you are, he finished, turning her to face him. Strength, illness, and all. She reached up to touch his face, marveling at how this man had changed her life with his quiet understanding and steadfast support. They called me lazy, she said softly, but you saw the truth. I saw you, he corrected, pulling her closer. Everything else was just noise. As they stood together in the gathering dusk, the ranch peaceful around them, Abigail reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From judgment to acceptance, from isolation to community, from strangers to lovers, and now husband and wife. The path hadn't been easy, but standing here in Kieran's arms, she knew every step had been worth it. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his breath warm against her hair. "That sometimes the most unexpected turns in life lead us exactly where we're meant to be," she replied. "And that I'm very glad you stopped to help with my basket that day." His laugh rumbled against her cheek. "Best decision I ever made." As they turned to enter their home, truly theirs now, shared in all ways, Abigail felt a profound gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought them together. Her illness remained an unpredictable companion that would always be part of their lives. But with Kieran beside her, it was no longer the defining feature of her existence. Instead, she was defined by love given and received freely, without condition or judgment. By a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. By the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, one day at a time. And in that knowledge, Abigail found a peace she had thought forever beyond her reach. Not because her circumstances had changed entirely, but because she was no longer facing them alone. In Kieran's eyes, she was never lazy or broken or less than whole. She was simply Abigail, strong, determined, and deeply loved. It was, she realized as Kieran closed the door behind them, everything she had ever needed. And everything she had never dared to hope for until a kind cowboy had carried her basket and changed her world with 4 simple words. "She works harder than any of you."